Hi, I'm Tony. Welcome to So Lounge. Today we are working with McCall's 8031, a shirtwaist dress. This is a beginner's level 3 pattern, and we are going to be putting together the collar. So Lounge is the place for beginners to learn to sew one pattern at a time. Be sure to like and subscribe to my channel so you never miss a stitch. Now, we are going to be starting with pattern instruction number 23, which is going to be some stay stitching around the collar, and then we are going to move through actually putting the collar pieces together and attaching them to the dress. Let's go in for a closer look. So we are on the part of the pattern instructions that pertain to the collar and the facing. Today we are just going to be focusing on the collar. Step number 23, we are going to stay stitch the neck edge of the dress. In 24, we are going to reinforce the upper collar and then turn the seam allowance. We're going to move on to 25, which has to do with the under collar, getting that interfacing attached and putting that together. Then we're going to turn the collar to the right side out. We're going to do some basting, and then we are going to attach it to the neck edge. Now, these are the overview of the steps. And as you can see, the upper collar is piece number 8, as indicated in instruction number 24. And then if you move down to 25, the under collar is piece number 7. Now, if we actually go over to our pattern pieces, piece number 7, correctly marked as the under collar for A, B, and C, but piece number 8 is not the under collar for A, B, and C. It is the upper collar. So this is one of those pattern misprints that happens on occasion. I just want to point it out to you because we're going by the pattern numbers. So worst case scenario, always go by the pattern piece numbers that are on the instructions and not necessarily by the way they are described, because in this instance you would think you had 2 under collars, not that it was a misprint. Just something to be aware of moving forward. So I'm at the sewing machine. The very first thing you want to do before you start stay stitching is to lift your machine out of the cabinet, if you're using a cabinet, or remove the sewing platform around the free arm so that you can move the neck edge easily around as we are sewing that stay stitching. Next, I'm going to turn on my machine. I'm going to set my length for 2.5, which is my standard stitch length. Now, keep in mind that stay stitching is not basting. So whenever you stay stitch, it's to add some reinforcement to the edge of the pattern pieces, but not necessarily a stitch line that you're going to want to remove. Basting is usually something we're going to remove later. Stay stitching is going to stay in the garment after it's constructed. We are going to be sewing this at a 1/2 inch. I have my handy little hem gauge, and we are going to measure that, and I'm going to move over my magnetic seam gauge to keep me all lined up, and then we are just going to get everything lined up and start sewing. Let's go in for a closer look. We are going to be putting in the stay stitching between the large dots. So the first dot is about 2 inches from the front edge of the dress. We are going to slide our neck edge in. We are going to lower the presser foot right over that dot, and then we are going to just start stay stitching. Now, as you come around to the shoulder seam, make sure you are holding those seams open and flat. You should have pressed them before this point, so they will be nice and open, but just make sure you can just stick your finger under there, just hold them open as you do your stay stitching around. And we are just following this neck edge. We do not want to pull it out. Hold your fabric. Don't let it hang off the table, because the last thing you want is to stretch this while you are putting in the stay stitching. Now we're just going around the back neck edge curve. You're coming up to the other shoulder seams, which we want to make sure we are holding open. And just pivot your dress around. And then we're going to be coming back up to this other dot here. and that is where we will stop. Okay, lift up your needle, lift up your presser foot, pull out your threads and cut them off, and you can see that we have that stay stitch line between the two large dots, and we are going to be working with pattern piece number 8. We are on step number 24, and we want pattern piece number 8, which is the upper collar, not the under collar as the pattern piece is labeled. So stick with the number 8 is the upper collar. That's what we're going to be going with. If your pattern piece is still attached, make sure you remove it. But before you remove it, make sure that you have marked the triangles and the dots that need to be transferred, because we are going to be using those in this step. We are going to be sewing across these little triangles. So we're going to have 2 little stitch lines going across the triangles. Excuse me. And then we're going to clip up to the triangle, and then we're going to fold this piece of seam between the 2 triangles underneath, and we're going to press it. To get started, make sure that you have your piece and that you have the triangles marked, because that's what we're going to be working with. Next, if you look at the pattern instructions, it says to use small stitches to reinforce this edge. Since my usual stitch length is 2.5, I'm going to go down to a 1, which is a really small stitch. We are just going across the triangles. We're sewing 1 layer. We are also going to be stitching on 5/8 of an inch. Get your seam gauge, your little measuring device, and get everything lined up so that you will be able to sew at 5/8 of an inch. Let's go in for a closer look. I have my magnetic seam gauge lined up on my 5/8 of an inch mark, and I have my first triangle. We're just going with the one that's up at that edge, and I am just going to slide that under. I'm going to start a little bit above the triangle so that then I can stitch across and through it. So I'm just going to start stitching. I'm going to lift up the presser foot just to see we've gone across. Yes, we have. So I'm just going to lower that presser foot, lift my needle, and then I'm going to pull that out. We're just putting a stitch line across this triangle here. We're going to move down and do the next one. It looks a little funny, but that is what the instructions are telling us to do, so we are going to do that. Just repeat the process on the other side. And then pull out that thread. Let's cut that off. And now we have both stitch lines above the little triangles. Next, we're going to clip this notch, and then we are going to fold and press this part of the seam. So we're at the ironing board, and as I mentioned, we are going to clip this seam to the triangle. That is going to be to the 5/8 inch mark. We are keeping 5/8 inch seam allowances on all of these pieces. So just make sure that you clip it to that 5/8 mark, and do not cut through the reinforcement threads that we just sewed. Next, we are going to be folding this seam under and pressing it at 5/8 of an inch. So you can either use a hem gauge and just set that to 5/8 of an inch, which will be that much, or if you have a Dritz Easy Hem, you can use that and press at 5/8 of an inch. Now we are pressing on a curve, so this is a good time to use the curved edge of the Dritz Easy Hem if that is what you're going to be working with. And my iron is set to cotton, high heat, with steam, because my fabric is 100% cotton, and that's the appropriate heat setting. Make sure that your iron is set for whatever is appropriate for the fiber content of your fabric. And I'm just going to go in and press that real quick at 5/8 of an inch and get that in there. I'm going to use a little steam. Let that cool. If you are using a Dritz Easy Hem, they do get hot, so be careful. And if you were just using a hem gauge, it's pretty much the same thing. We're just going to fold that seam up, measure it 5/8 of an inch, apply a little steam, let that cool, move down a little bit, And we want to make sure we keep that whole thing at 5/8 of an inch. So just get everything lined up, then press and keep moving down. So there we go. Last little bit here, we're going to press that up. So once you've finished pressing that seam under, we're just going to put that piece to the side. That is piece number 8. And if you have not attached the interfacing to piece number 7, now is the time to do that. You want to make sure it's attached before we go and move on to the next step and sew the upper collar to the under collar. One thing to keep in mind is if you are using dark colored fabric, there is such a thing as black interfacing. So interfacing pretty much comes in 2 colors, white and black. There is not as much of a selection of all the different weights and possibilities in black, but you will likely be able to find one that is the right weight for your fabric. This is a lightweight black iron-in interfacing. And as we have previously mentioned, iron-in is not ironed in. It's pressed in. So we are going to press in this interfacing. And to get started, I'm going to match up the notches with the notches of my pattern piece and get everything lined up. And my iron is on hot. I'm going to turn down the steam a little bit. I do like to use steam when I use interfacing, not too much because you don't want it to start disintegrating, but you do want it to stick to the fabric, and to do that you need to use a lot of heat. So whatever's good for your fabric should be good for your interfacing. I'm just going to start here at this notch, and then I'm just going to slowly move down the interfacing. Now remember, when you are putting in interfacing, you want to press it in, not iron it in. So you do not push your iron around on the interfacing. That will make it disintegrate. That will make it bunch up on your fabric, and that is not what we want. We want this to be nice and flat. If you have to keep going over it a couple of times, you can do that. Once you have it in place, you can go back in and apply some steam. You do not want to move this once you start this process, because you want to make sure everything sets and that it is firmly attached to the pattern piece below. So just keep working on that until everything is stuck. Let it cool for a second. Sometimes if your interfacing is a little bit bigger than your pattern piece, it might stick to your ironing board. You can always pull it off. All right, so you can see that we have it all nice and attached. It's not bunched up anywhere, and it looks nice and smooth. So I'm going to go in and trim out these little extra edges where it kind of overlapped a little bit so that we can get everything even, and then we will move on to the next step. We are at step number 25, and that is going to be to pin the under collar, piece number 7, to the upper collar, matching the centers and the large circles. Now I have no idea what they mean by centers. We can get the triangles lined up on top of each other. Maybe that's what they mean. I'm not sure. Large circles is easy. On our pattern pieces, we had transferred them from the pattern pieces to the fabric. So that is what we're going to be matching up. I'm going to be pinning on the side with the interfacing. So you want to make sure that the right sides are together and the wrong sides are out. That means that on the under collar, it's going to be the interfacing side. On the upper collar, it's going to be the side that we folded the seam allowance over. So make sure you match up those dots. You can check the triangles. I'm, like I said, not sure if that's what they meant by the centers, but I've got those matched up. I can actually put a pin in there just to hold those in place if we want. We're not going to be sewing along that top edge where that folded seam is. That will be dealt with later. But one thing I do want to point out is that once you have pinned everything where it's supposed to be, if you go to the side with the interfacing, you are going to notice that the upper collar is larger than the under collar. And I'm not gonna lie, it's stressing me out a little bit, but if you keep reading the instructions, the next sentence says, stitch stretching under collar to fit. If you look at the pattern piece for the under collar, and this is piece number 7, across that top edge, it says stretch. So that is the indication that while we are sewing, we want to pull the under collar to the upper collar and then sew them together. That is why we are going to be sewing from the interfacing side, so we can see when we get to that edge how much we need to pull it. We're going to go in for a closer look, and then we're going to head to the sewing machine. We're looking at the interfacing side. We do have our wrong sides together, and you can see here along this edge, and that is what I was talking about, the part that is stressing me out. And more than anything, I want to go and trim that off and even it up, but we're not supposed to do that. So as we're sewing, we're going to start at the large dot here. We're going to sew at 5/8 of an inch. We're going to pivot. And then once we pivot, we want to start pulling this interfacing side to line up with the edge that is the upper collar. So that's how we're going to remedy this problem. It is allegedly built into the pattern, so it should all work out at the end. I am hoping that this is not user error and it is not this wonky just because I cut it a little too loose. As I've mentioned, this fabric does shift around a lot, so that could have happened as well, but we will do our best and keep moving forward. So let's head over to the sewing machine and sew this top edge. All right, I am back at the sewing machine, and the first thing I want to do before I even think about sewing is make sure that my stitch length has been reset to my usual 2.5, because remember last time we sewed, we were sewing at a 1 to reinforce those little triangles. And so I'm going to reset my machine to a 2.5 straight stitch. That's what we're sewing on. And we are going to be sewing at 5/8 of an inch, so we can leave our magnetic seam gauge where it is and not have to stress about that. And last, we are going to be sewing from the dot, which you can't see from the side of the interfacing because we covered it up, but you can pin it through from the back and then match it with the center ones. So you can get those dots all lined up and then just put in a pin. And where that pin starts is where we're going to start stitching. As I mentioned, we are going to be pulling this bottom piece, the bottom collar, the under collar, which is the side with the interfacing, we are going to be stretching that to fit the upper collar along this outside edge. And let's go in for a closer look. So this is where we're going to be starting. I'm going to grab my chalk pencil and just going to put a mark here on top of this pin because I do need to pull this pin out in order to get started here. So I'm going to just pull that pin out and I'm going to get this lined up. And so I'm starting right on that large circle. Now this is the part that's the easy part because we're just going to be matching this outside edge and it lines up. So we don't have any problems there. I'm just going to start stitching. And then at 5/8 of an inch, I want to turn. So I am going to grab my measuring gauge and I'm just going to mark where 5/8 is so that I can stop and pivot my needle. So I'm just going to keep stitching until I get to that line and I'm there. So I'm going to lift up my needle, I'm going to pivot my fabric, and then I'm going to lower my presser foot again. Now this is the part where we want to stretch this top piece to match the bottom. Now previously we had put pins in along the top edge. I'm going to pull those out because I think we need to have a little bit more flexibility in here for the stretching part. So I am going to do my best and hopefully this will not be a total disaster. So just start stitching. And now I want to see that, okay, so my interfacing isn't quite lined up, but my edges are, so I'm just going to keep those together. And I'm just going to keep stitching. Okay, so now we're coming back down here. So you can see that down here, it's a little bit wider. So this is where we're going to really have to start pulling it to make it all line up. So I'm going to keep stitching and stretching. And then down here, still not matching up. So we want to stitch it over and grab it. There we go. And once again, since we are coming back to the 5/8 inch mark, I want to make sure I mark that so that I know where to pivot. I'm just going to mark that. And then while I'm here, I'm going to mark where to stop over here on this pin because we will need to pull that one out as well. And I'm just going to keep stitching. Once I get to that line, I'm going to lift my presser foot and turn my fabric, my collar. And you can kind of see that this is not matching up through here, which is causing me stress. But let's see if we can get these dots back matched up. And those are still where they're supposed to be. I'm going to put that pin back in there just for now. And then I'm just going to make the executive decision that I'm just going to fold up that edge, and we're just going to sew along the edge of the interfacing and not worry about that because it does match back up here. Keep stitching. I'm going to pull that pin out. When we get to that circle, we are going to stop. Okay. And we have our collar sewn together. Let's head back to the cutting table. Moving on, in step number 25, next part of this, the next sentence is to trim the seam allowances. So I'm hoping that it all works out and we're going to trim the seam allowances. So I'm not going to stress about this anymore because here's the reality of the situation. If it's not perfect, the only one that's going to know is me when I wear it. And anybody who looks at me wearing this dress is not going to think like, oh, that collar isn't quite straight. So keep that in mind. If you're stressing out, that's what I'm going to do, and keep moving forward. Now, when we're trimming the seam, I'm going to trim it about 1/8 of an inch, and I'm just going to go down along the part that we just stitched. Take your time. Do not cut the stitch line or you're going to have to start again. And if you're out of fabric like I am, that will be problematic. Then what you can also do is trim across these corners. So you want to get very, very close to that stitch line, but not cross it. So do that at both of the corners. And then the next step is to understitch the collar as far as possible. So we have this little tiny seam allowance left. We're going to press that towards the interfacing side of the undercollar, and then we are going to head back to the sewing machine. This is a really quick close-up of the inside seam, and that is what we want to fold towards the interfacing side, which is the undercollar. And then we want to press that seam in place so that when we go in and understitch from the outside, we'll be able to catch that little seam allowance and it will be going in the right direction. Now set your iron, and one thing to keep in mind is because you have interfacing under here, you absolutely must press this in. So lift and move your iron as you are pressing that tiny seam, which is kind of hard to see in there, and do your best, but do not push it around, because the last thing you want is to mess up the interfacing at this point when we're more than halfway through finishing this collar. So just get in there, press it towards the interfacing side, and then we're going to head to the sewing machine. So almost finished with step number 25, and we are going to understitch. Now, understitching is when you sew from the right side of the garment. So we're going to be sewing from the right side of the collar, and we're going to be catching this little edge under here, and it's just going to secure that seam, and it's going to create a crisper edge once we flip the collar and fold everything to the right side and attach it. So it's just going to give you a little bit of sharpness. You can also press from the right side after you have pressed the seam allowance over towards the interfacing side of the undercollar, just to crisp it up a little bit more. That's what I tend to do. And we are going to get this lined up and do some understitching. Let's go in for a closer look. All right, so I am getting everything all lined up on the inside. Because we have the point of the collar, we're not going to be able to get all the way to that edge, so just kind of start wherever you can get your presser foot in without tearing out the side seam. I am going to be sewing this at 1/8 of an inch, so I have my needle just slightly over from the seam line that we previously sewed, and I am just going to roll this down to get started, and I am going to backstitch just to kind of finish that so it doesn't come out. I just backstitch, and then I'm going to go forward again, keeping everything all lined up. And just stitching. So as we're coming to the other side, you can see we're going to probably need to stop about right here. I'm just going to keep stitching. And then I'm just going to backstitch a couple of stitches. And I'm going to be done. So just take that out, and then when you look at it, you're going to have a stitch line, and that's going to be on the underside of the collar. So that's the upper collar, there's the under collar. You can see from the inside where we caught our seam in there. You may not want to trim it quite as close as I did. That was a little close. Probably leave it about 1/4 of an inch so you have enough edge to catch without any raveling. And then next we are going to flip the collar to the right side. We're going to press it again, and then we're going to do some basting. We finally made it to step number 26, which tells us that we want to turn our collar right side out, and then we're going to press it, and then we're going to baste it. Now, below the instruction and below the little diagram is a tip that suggests you use a point turner or a knitting needle to poke out the corners to get nice sharp corners in your collar. So this is one reason why we did clip off the edge so that we would have a nice little point. And I'm going to go to both ends and just gently poke that out so that we have a point at the end of our collar. And take your time. It doesn't have to be super, super pointy. It just needs to be a point. So however you want to do that, once you have that done, then we are going to press. And now when you look at your collar, you may notice that it seems that the top collar is kind of rolling towards the under collar a little bit. So you might want to pull it as you're pressing so that nice edge that we just understitched is staying on the underside of the collar. And I'm just going to press along this edge with some steam. Be careful you don't burn yourself because it is hot. And then we're just going to go over these side seams as well. So just make sure those are nice and lined up. And then you can press and add steam. So once everything looks nice and neat, you can go back to the other side, make sure that it's all pulled towards the right side of the collar, and give it one last little press. Better to press now and then not have to worry about it later. So I'm just going to go back over everything real quick, let it cool, and now we are going to head back to the sewing machine and baste. We're at the sewing machine, and since we're going to be basting, we want to adjust our stitch length to the longest stitch that our machine makes. Now on my Bernina, that's a 5. Whatever the longest stitch is for your individual brand is the one you want to go with. That may be a 4 and maybe a 6, whatever it is. One thing to point out is the instructions for step number 26 say to baste the raw edges. So you may be thinking like, oh, okay, that's a raw edge, I'm just going to baste the whole thing. But if you look at the diagram, it shows that you are basting between the dot that was over here on the side. You can still kind of see it from where we started the collar, and then we're basting to the triangle. We are skipping over this middle section, and then we are picking up again from the triangle on the other side and basting to the circle. So that is something that is not explicitly stated in the instructions, but when you look at the diagram, that is what it shows. So that is what we are going to be sewing. Let's go in for a closer look. So if you turn your collar, you can see on the edge that that is where the dot was. So that is where we're going to start stitching for this basting. So I'm just going to line that up because we want to be sewing between these specific marks. We're just going to do a basting stitch, and I'm just going to hold that so that I'm going across to my triangle. Once I get to the triangle, I'm just going to stop. I'm going to pull out that stitching, and now I'm just going to slide the rest of my collar underneath. I'm going to start at the triangle at the other side, roll that down, and I'm just going to baste straight across to the other dot. So once it's finished, that's how it's going to look. There's going to be basting there, it's going to be open in the middle, and then there's more basting at the other end. Step 27 is pinning the collar to this neckline edge, and the instructions say to match the centers, symbols, and notches. So we are going to match these triangles with the shoulder seams because those are all the same symbols. And I have pins somewhere. Here we go. So I'm going to start with those. I'm going to put in a pin, and then I'm going to go to the other shoulder where there's another triangle. Get those all matched up. Then there should also be some dots that are still visible from the front. So that is where we are going to match these dots. Remember that when we did the stay stitching on the neck edge, we started at that large dot. That is the same large dot from the side of the collar that we are going to be matching up together. So get those lined up, put in a pin. Let's go around to the other side and do exactly the same thing. So I'm going to get that dot lined up, and I'm going to put in a pin. Now there should also be some little notches along the neckline, so you want to make sure those are all matched up. You can add in some extra pins to make everything fit. The other instruction is to clip the neck edge to the stay stitching so that you can fit everything around. So another reason for stay stitching is to hold things in place. So I'm just going to clip along the center back, and by clipping, we're just going in close to that stay stitch line. I think I'm stopping about 1/8 of an inch from it, and that's just going to help us turn this curve while we are attaching all these pieces together. Once you've gone in and snipped out those edges, now you should be able to go in and pin everything together so that it's all lined nice and smooth. By making those clips, you're going to let the fabric loosen a little bit and release, and that will help you get everything all lined up. Put in as many pins as you need. Some people are anti-pin. I am not. I think that if you're comfortable with more pins, you should use them, which is what I do. Sometimes I need more, sometimes I need less. So just finish putting in your pins, get that edge all lined up. Now, one thing to keep in mind is this folded under edge that we had done as part of the upper collar step number 24, you do not want to pin that, okay? So you're still leaving that loose, and you're just pinning the other part of the collar, that's the underside of the collar that has the interfacing attached to it. That's what you're pinning to the neckline through this center piece of the collar. And then with everything else, you just want to get the edges all lined up. And once you have that done, and the notches are matched, wait, I'm not done on this side. Okay, almost. There we go. Let's head back to the sewing machine, and we are going to attach the collar to the neck edge. We're back at the sewing machine, and I misspoke earlier because we are not going to be permanently stitching the collar to the neckline. We are going to be basting again. We will permanently stitch everything together once we attach the facings to the front of the dress, and then we're going to sew the facings, the collar, and then the other side of the facings all in one fell swoop. So we will get to that in an upcoming video. For now, your machine should still be set to a basting stitch, so you do not have to worry about that. And because we know we're going to be doing some more final stitching later down the line, we want to make sure that the basting stitches are inside of the seam line. So I'm going to sew the basting stitches in at 1/2 inch instead of 5/8 of an inch. And I'm going to use my little measuring gauge, get my magnetic seam gauge all lined up at a 1/2 inch mark. And then I'm going to get ready to baste. Now, one other thing to keep in mind is we are not basting across the entire top neck edge of the dress. We are just basting from where we pinned to the same spot on the other side. So let's get everything lined up. And let's go in for a closer look. So we have our presser foot lowered. I am starting right at that edge where the dot is. So I'm a little bit off of the collar. That's going to be okay because we are basting. And I am just going to roll my needle down to get started. And then as you can see over here, I am lined up with that 1/2 inch mark, which is one closer to the presser foot. So we're just going to keep this all lined up, and I am going to baste. I'm going to remove each pin as I get to it. And once we start coming to the opening down here, let me back out a little bit. Oops. So you can see that we want to baste on the side with the interfacing, and we want to keep this part free. So I'm going to pull this pin out up here. And then this is where it gets a tiny bit tricky. I'm going to hold that down, and I'm just going to keep basting and not catch that edge. So you can see we came over a little bit, that's okay. And I'm gonna just keep basting to hold this all together, but not catch that top edge, because we're gonna go back in and slip stitch that once we do all the final stitching. Just take out these pins, keep stitching, and we're just gonna still do that same kind of weird pull things out and hold. So I'm just going to pull this back this way, and we're going to just stitch across and take out these pins as we get to them. And then we're just going to finish, make sure those edges are lined up. Yes, we're going to just finish this bottom edge down here. A couple of last pins, I'm going to pull that one out. Hold this in place, and then we are just going to lift up that needle. And you can see we stopped at the dot on this side, just a little bit past it. That opening is still available. We have our basting stitches all in there. And then that is where we started, and our dot is just underneath right there. So now you know how to attach a collar to a neck edge, sort of. We're not quite finished yet, but as you can see, it's starting to actually look like a collar, so I'm super excited about that based on my past collar trauma. And if you look at the pattern, you can see that there's a little bit of a notch there in this lower part under the collar, and that's going to be where we attach the facing. So that's going to be the next step. And at some point, I will come back and do a regular collar on a dress that does not have that front notch detail. But you kind of get the idea here, and it's a good place to get started. If you've enjoyed this video, be sure to click like and subscribe to my channel so you never miss a stitch. And if you've got questions but no one to answer them, head on over to Let's Talk Sewing for Beginners, hosted by Sew Lounge. It's an interactive Facebook group where you can ask all the questions you want, and I will get you some answers. Until we meet again, happy sewing!